Every financial channel, every retirement podcast, every advisor you've ever watched will eventually say the same thing. Pay off your mortgage before you retire. It sounds responsible. It sounds obvious. And for the roughly 65% of Americans who own homes, maybe it's even useful advice. But what about the other 35%? There are somewhere between 30 and 40 million people in this country age 55 to 65 who rent. They're not broke. They're not irresponsible. A lot of them make solid incomes, have real savings, and have been doing everything else right for decades. But they can't pay off the mortgage because they don't have one. And so the most repeated retirement checklist in personal finance just doesn't apply to them. I've watched this play out enough times to know how it lands. You're sitting there, financially in decent shape, and some expert tells you sign one is being mortgage-free. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet version of I'm behind starts running. That's not financial advice. That's a system built around one path, treating it like the only path. The math in 2026 doesn't support that. Renting is not a consolation prize. For a lot of people approaching retirement, it's actually a more flexible, more liquid, and in some cases more financially sound position than carrying a property into their 60s. So if you don't own a home and you're wondering whether you can retire safely, here are 8 signs you can, including both the financial and psychological ones, built entirely around the reality that you rent. Subscribe if you want more analysis that pushes back on the conventional wisdom. And let's get into it. Most people think the signal to retire is hitting a number, $1 million, $1,500,000, some round figure they read somewhere and decided to treat like a finish line. But the number in your account isn't actually what determines whether you can retire safely. What matters is how much you pull from it every year and whether that rate is sustainable for 25 to 30 years. That's the withdrawal rate. And if you haven't revisited how it works recently, this is the part you need to hear. For years, the standard rule was 4%. Take 4% of your portfolio in year one, adjust for inflation annually, and statistically your money outlasts you. It was clean, it was simple, and it became the default answer to every retirement planning question. I used to repeat that in older videos without much hesitation. But when I went back through Morningstar's updated state of retirement income data for 2025 and 2026, I had to update my thinking. A fixed rule from the 1990s, built on a specific interest rate environment that no longer exists, deserves more scrutiny than it usually gets. So here's what the current data actually shows. For a balanced portfolio with a 30-year horizon, Morningstar now pegs the baseline safe withdrawal rate at around 3.9%. That's a shift, but not a dramatic one. What's more interesting is the second number. If you're willing to spend flexibly, meaning you pull back a bit during market downturns, instead of drawing the same fixed amount no matter what, that rate can climb closer to 6%. That gap is significant. Say you have $900,000 saved. At 3.9%, that's about $35,100 per year. At a flexible 5.5%, that same portfolio could support around $49,500. On a fixed income, that difference changes what retirement actually looks like day to day. The trade-off of clinging to an overly cautious withdrawal rate is quieter than most people realize. You work longer than you needed to. You delay the trips, the slower mornings, the time with people you actually want to be around. And then, statistically, there's a real chance you die with a substantial account balance that never got spent on anything that mattered to you. That's not safety. That's the cost of an outdated rule applied too rigidly. Now, the flexibility approach requires one thing: you have to know what you actually spend. Not an estimate, not a rough figure. The real number, including rent. And that's where a lot of renters hit a wall. Because rent, unlike a fixed mortgage payment, can move on you. It has in the past. It might again. But to know whether your withdrawal rate holds up against that, you first have to know exactly what you're spending. And that's where we go next. Here's the argument you'll hear from almost every homeownership advocate. Rent is throwing money away. I've heard it so many times it barely registers anymore. But let's actually run it. When you own a home, your monthly costs aren't just the mortgage. You're paying property tax. You're covering maintenance. And the rule of thumb is 1% to 2% of the home's value per year. You're carrying homeowners insurance, which has been climbing fast in a lot of states due to climate-related claims and rising material costs. And if something breaks, the call comes to you. When you rent, you write one check. Everything else is the landlord's problem. But here's the part that actually changes the math for someone approaching retirement. Every dollar that isn't locked into a down payment or tied up in home equity is a dollar that can stay invested. Take someone who chose to rent instead of buying a $400,000 home. That's potentially $80,000 in a down payment that stayed in the market. At a conservative 7% average annual return over 20 years, that's roughly $310,000 in additional portfolio value. The walls didn't grow that money. The market did. I'm not going to tell you where home prices are going in the next 10 years. I genuinely don't know, and anyone claiming certainty on that is selling something. What I can do is run the cash flow numbers on what we actually have. As of early 2026, the median rent across all housing types in the U.S. sits somewhere between $1,640 and $1,740 per month. And the rent inflation rate, the rent CPI, is projected to come in around 2.9% for 2026. That's meaningfully lower than the spike years we saw earlier this decade. So if you model rent increasing at roughly 3% per year and your invested capital is returning 7% to 8% annually, the math works in your favor. Your investment growth outpaces your rent growth. The gap between those two numbers is what funds your retirement. That's sign 2. You understand this equation. You're not afraid of rent going up because you've already modeled it. You know what 3% annual increases look like over 15 years, and you've confirmed your portfolio can absorb it. Sign 3 is the mobility piece, and it's underrated. If you own a home and your property taxes spike, or your neighborhood changes, or a cheaper cost of living state starts looking attractive, you're stuck. Selling a house takes months, costs 6% to 8% in transaction fees, and is not something most people want to navigate in their 60s. If you rent, you can move. That optionality has real dollar value that never shows up on a balance sheet. Someone renting in a high-cost city right now could, if needed, relocate to a state where the same lifestyle costs 20% to 30% less. That's not a downgrade. That's leverage. And for a retiree on a fixed withdrawal, that kind of flexibility can extend a portfolio by years. Buying a home at 60 because you feel like you're supposed to is what locks you in. Continuing to rent and keeping your capital invested is what keeps your options open. That's the resilience path, not the glamorous one, but the one that holds up when things don't go according to plan. The rent math is settled. The next sign we need to talk about is the expense that can wipe out a portfolio faster than rent ever will. There's a number most people planning early retirement don't want to think about too hard. $172,500. That's Fidelity's 2025 estimate for what a single 65-year-old retiring today should expect to spend on healthcare costs over the course of retirement. And that figure assumes you're starting Medicare on day one at 65. It doesn't include the years before that. If you're retiring at 55, you have a 10-year gap where you're on your own. No employer plan, no Medicare, just you, the open market, and whatever ACA has to offer that year. I've been close to this calculation myself, and I've watched it stop people cold. Not because they couldn't afford it, but because they never actually sat down and ran the real numbers. They assumed it would be catastrophic and kept working. Some of them were right to wait. A lot of them weren't. Here's what the gap actually looks like in practice. A healthy 57-year-old buying coverage through the ACA marketplace today could be looking at anywhere from $500 to $800 per month in premiums, depending on the plan and the state. That's $6,000 to $9,600 per year before deductibles. Over 8 years until Medicare kicks in, you're talking about a potential out-of-pocket insurance cost of $48,000 to $76,800, not counting what you actually use. That's real money. It belongs in your retirement model, not as a footnote. But here's the part the headline number usually skips. Your ACA premium is based on your modified adjusted gross income, your MAGI, not your net worth, not your portfolio size, what you report as income. This is where thoughtful retirement income planning changes the math entirely. If you structure your withdrawals carefully, pulling from Roth accounts, keeping taxable income low, managing capital gains distributions, you may qualify for substantial ACA subsidies. Some retirees with significant assets are paying under $200 a month in premiums because their reportable income stays below the threshold. That's not a loophole. That's the system working as designed, and knowing how to use it is sign 4. You've modeled the healthcare gap, and you have a plan for bridging it. Sign 5 is simpler, but it matters just as much. Your health right now. This sounds uncomfortable to say directly, but early retirement is a time-sensitive decision in a way that most financial planning ignores. The gap between retiring at 55 in good health versus 65 with the physical limitations that a decade of desk work and stress can bring is not a small gap. It's the difference between hiking a national park and watching a documentary about one. The research on this is consistent. The early years of retirement, when you're still mobile, still curious, still able to do the things you've been putting off, those years have a value that no account balance can replace once they're gone. So the question isn't just, can I afford to retire at 55? It's what does waiting cost me in years I can't get back? The cash flow math, the rent equation, the healthcare gap, all of that is solvable. The next 2 signs aren't about money at all. I got a comment a while back that I keep coming back to. Someone said they were 52, had $2,300,000 saved, and still set their alarm for 5:45 every morning to go to a job they'd stopped caring about years ago. Not because they needed the paycheck, but because spending down a portfolio felt wrong in a way they couldn't fully explain. Like something bad would happen if they stopped accumulating. That's not a math problem. That's saver's guilt. And it's more common at this level of wealth than most people admit. For 30 years, the behavior that kept you financially safe was simple. Earn more, spend less, save the difference. That pattern becomes identity. It becomes the thing you point to when you need proof that you've been responsible, that you've done it right. And then one day, the model says you have enough, and suddenly the behavior that protected you for 3 decades starts working against you. Spending your own money, money you earned, money you saved, starts to feel like failure. That's sign 6. Not having the guilt, but recognizing it for what it is. The people who are genuinely ready to retire aren't the ones who have eliminated the anxiety entirely. They're the ones who can name it, separate it from the actual math, and make decisions anyway. Sign 7 is the identity question, and it's harder. A lot of people in their late 50s have spent so long being the CFO or the project lead or simply the provider that retirement feels less like freedom and less like loss. The title goes away. The structure goes away. The sense of being needed in a specific, legible way goes away. I've thought about this one myself. There's a version of staying at work that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with not knowing who you are outside of it. That's worth sitting with before you hand in the notice, not as a reason to delay indefinitely, but as something to build toward. What does a Tuesday look like when it belongs entirely to you? If you have a real answer to that, even a rough one, you're further along than most. The retirees I've watched navigate this transition well had one thing in common. They didn't retire from something. They retired toward something. A slower pace, a project, a place, a relationship that had been getting the leftover hours for too long. The shift from accumulator to spender isn't just a budget adjustment. It's a full identity reset. And being willing to make that shift consciously, deliberately, not just waiting until your body forces the decision, that's the sign. If you're nodding at any of this, the final piece is the most practical one, because knowing you're ready and having a structured exit are two different things. Most people who say they want to retire early have a feeling, not a plan. The feeling is real. The exhaustion is real. The daydream about the last day of work is real. But a feeling doesn't tell you which account to draw from first, or how to handle taxes in year 1, or what happens to your health care the day your employer coverage ends. Sign 8 is having an actual exit strategy, not a number you're hoping to hit someday. A documented sequence of steps you could start executing next month if you had to. For renters specifically, that strategy has 3 components. The first is building what I call the renter's budget. Not a rough estimate. Open a spreadsheet, put in your current rent, and apply a 3% annual increase for 30 years. Look at what that number becomes in year 10, year 20, year 30. Most people find it's more manageable than the fear in their head suggested. The goal is to stop treating rent as an unknown threat and start treating it as a known, modelable expense. Once it's in the model, you can plan around it. The second step is diversifying your income streams to stay ahead of inflation. A portfolio withdrawal is one source. But the retirees who sleep best usually have 2 or 3. Dividend income from a well-constructed equity portfolio. Interest from bonds or high-yield savings. And for a lot of people, a semi-retirement arrangement, part-time consulting, a small advisory role, something that generates $15,000 to $25,000 a year without consuming your life. That buffer changes the math on how hard your portfolio has to work. The third step is one most people don't think to ask for, a phased retirement conversation with your employer. Before you hand in a resignation letter, consider asking HR about reducing your hours instead. Dropping to 60% or 70% of your current schedule while retaining benefits is a legitimate arrangement at a lot of companies, particularly for experienced employees who would be expensive to replace. You keep the healthcare coverage. You keep some income. You give yourself a transition period instead of a cliff. That runway matters. Jumping from full-time employment to full retirement in a single day is a significant psychological shift, and having 12 to 18 months of reduced hours to adjust your spending patterns and your sense of structure makes the landing considerably softer. None of these steps require a financial advisor, a perfect market, or a paid-off house. They require a spreadsheet, an honest conversation with your employer, and the willingness to treat retirement as something you plan for, rather than something that happens to you. That's the whole difference between people who retire confidently and people who drift into it unprepared. Retirement was never supposed to be a reward for owning the right asset. It's a math problem and a psychological one. And for the roughly 35% of Americans approaching 65 who rent, the traditional checklist has been leaving them out of the conversation for a long time. What we covered today isn't a workaround for people who couldn't buy a home. It's a legitimate framework for people whose financial life looks different from the one most retirement content was built around. Renting is not failure. Spending money you earned and saved is not irresponsible. And needing permission from a spreadsheet instead of a deed is not a sign that you haven't done enough. The 8 signs we walked through, from understanding your real withdrawal rate, to modeling the rent equation, to bridging the healthcare gap, to naming the psychological barriers that keep capable people working longer than they need to. None of them require a mortgage payoff to trigger. They require clarity and a willingness to look at your actual numbers instead of the numbers you think you're supposed to have. If this breakdown helped you see your situation differently, and especially if it gave you a cleaner way to think about retiring without a home you own, hit subscribe. We'll keep working through the parts of personal finance that the standard playbook tends to skip. I'll see you in the next one.